Hi, Dan here.
Hello, hello. Teresa here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. How are you doing today?
Great, great. Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much for being here. You have no idea how much I love your work. So it just really means a lot to me that you're taking the time out to do this interview with me.
Appreciate it. I'm happy to share.
Thank you. So I was actually divinely guided to your work. I've been channeling over the last year and a half of my life. Things have gotten pretty weird for me. And I've been channeling some really dense packages of information and some of it related to bliss. And then I found you, and really a lot started to kind of come together for me. So I have incorporated a lot of what you teach into what I teach. And I do a lot of speaking at conferences and things like that. So I just want to say thank you for your work.
Well, thank you. And maybe we can share a little bit about the science when you're ready. Fine.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to speaker view so that I can capture more of your face when you're talking so that I can use the video. So I'm going to do that really quick. And then I'm going to, okay, here we go. Okay, are we ready?
I think we are.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into the questions. And yeah, we can just go from there. So, in the beginning of what I'm talking about, I want to kind of paint a picture about the battle of good versus evil. And then I'm going to kind of expand that into transcendence and bliss and taking back personal power. So, I kind of wanted to start with if you could kind of paint a picture for us. I know you talk about ET history, you go way back, which is fascinating. Can you give us just a little sound clip about the battle of good versus evil to kind of paint that picture for people coming into this documentary?
Well, just ask a scientist what's the difference between good and evil. From my point of view, constructive wave interference creates sustainability, and destructive interference is the opposite. Or another way of saying it is evil is live spelled backwards, and live, L into the I of phi, means to fall into the focus of embedding. So literally that which is embeddable becomes shareable, fractal and distributable and sustainable, and kind of defines sustainability, defines actually goodness in that sense, as in survival memory that goes through death. In another level, from the extraterrestrial or ET ancient history perspective, I would say that civilizations which respected individual freedom, which create, respect for indigenous peoples and respect for, independence in that sense. What that means is that if you set people free, eventually they take that which steers the tornado inside themselves, in the sense of you too can be God. So the sacredness of individual freedom, the prime directive, thou shalt not interfere, defines good in the sense that it understands that ultimately if people don't take responsibility inside themselves for what they used to call divine, they will never grow up and steer tornadoes and steer the sun. So that's another sense of the term good versus evil, I suppose.
Thank you. That was exactly what I needed for that. Thank you. Thank you. So I wanted to next ask you about fear. And because I know that in our world, especially, fear is used against us. It's a tool that's used to keep us into lower vibrations, to prevent us from being able to achieve these higher states of consciousness. And I wanted to ask you about the weight of fear. What does fear cost us? And I know you talk about internal coherence and how important that is, and even the concept of stars breaking apart due to the lack of internal coherence. Can we talk about that for a little bit?
Well, again, from the point of view of science, you know that the best scientific description of emotion probably ever was when Manfred Klein's with Centix determined in the music literature there's very specific geometric wave shapes associated with emotion that you could read about. The pictures goldenmean.info/touch. And very simply, when you touch someone to say I love you, the max pressure in the duration of that squeeze creates a wave shape with golden ratio as the maxima, meaning implosive constructive interference. Literally, the Valentine or perfect embedding is a love touch, prime example of the geometry of pressure of the perfect birth canal, the physics of rebirthing. So The Centix literature was clear, joy 1/6, anger 1/7, destructive wave, etc. But fear, interestingly, did not have a wave shape. And if we look at why, it appears that fear is pure resistance to spin electrically. Stop the world, I want to get off sort of thing. So now, that doesn't mean fear is not useless. Fear is not a mistake God made. Sometimes you need to teach a child to be afraid of putting their hand on the stove. That would be... No, but what it does mean, however, is that what gives you power, that is your ability to relax enough to embed and become the center of any tornado, including the sun, is the opposite of fear. A perfect relaxation, for example, which is measurably electrically conductive, is the only way to take the benefit of the plasma of Therify.net, or any blessing, for example. So being able to relax is the only way you gain inertia and therefore become centripetal. So, for example, if you're fighting or something, you do need to relax and not feel fear, or you will not be centripetal or gain inertia. So in that sense, the advanced spiritual being knows how to conquer their fear. That is true.
Thank you so much for that. So next, I would like to ask you, what occurs during a Kundalini awakening?
Well, that is something of my specialty, I suppose. We've been working on that a long time. There are many levels of answer, but mechanically, we can measure the phonon. The sound waves go up the spine liquid pump. Sacrocranial pump is the mechanism, there's no question. Bentoff's book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum. All of the pictures and graphics at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. Basically, not only is there a phonon wave goes up the tailbone, starting with the threads at the tailbone, which used to be your tail hairs, which conduct the ultraviolet component. But so there's this high frequency ultraviolet. In fact, we have measured Kundalini in the spine in the microwave, believe it or not. Dratch's work, microwave emission scanning technology, meaning that essentially Kundalini is a climax of metabolic increase to the point of metabolic lightning, which this phonon, the sound wave up the spine liquid, is only the carrier wave for very high frequency. And it does feel like a lightning bolt coming up your tailbone and going out the top of your head, and it's the flames of Pentecost, Penta being the 50 faces of the Platonics being consumed perspective. So, Kundalini is plasma implosion par excellence biologic, meaning literally by definition, it is the implosion of information density. Very cool. Like anybody that survived near death from lightning, like Daniel Brinkley and the movie Powder, they came back with lots of information, actually. Lots, because it was literally the compression of mind. Mind is nothing but that implosion in plasma. So obviously, if you can inhabit lightning and not get toasted, it's information dense. But on the other hand, it is life-threatening, and it can be very dangerous. It stresses the mineral-water bond. Metabolism goes to climax. Dehydration is a symptom. Grounding is essential. Actually, all of the things that, if you do plasma therapy, which accelerates metabolism, similar requirements. So read the book Earthing, learn how to ground, learn how to not to dehydrate. If you want Kundalini, expect to learn how to inhabit a lightning bolt. Psychologically, last thought. The reason that an angry thought, an idea, which is not shareable at the moment of Kundalini or at the moment of death, or at the moment of being crowned king, when your metabolism goes to that lightning, will drive you insane quicker because resistance to spin generating heat will toast you ever more fast the closer you get to the center of that lightning bolt. So preparing for Kundalini is exactly like preparing for death. And we know that the death visions are electrically contagious, as I've said many times, because you know that successful death is literally an electric black hole, as Dr. Ray Moody proved, meaning that to inhabit the center of implosion, you need what's called pure intention, which means to be able to focus on only those memories which serve pure survival, which is to say pure principle.
So you can gain, it sounds like you said you can gain access to a whole lot of information during Kundalini.
For example, why I'm able to talk fast.
Okay, so I loved when you were talking about, is it EB versus Ubu, bird versus snake, left and right brain is how what I pulled out of that, and you said that that's the joining of Quetzalcoatl. That's when Quetzalcoatl returns. When you were describing Kundalini, can you describe this for me, please? Because I'm really interested in this concept.
Well, historically, the uru, which became the reptilian snake brain, the mouth of which is the amygdala, from which that Sanchidan snake venom emerges at the base of the brain. The uru was the ancient Draco blood, which we called Uru Asa Elem, and they were a powerful people that were dominant, and they lacked compassion, I suppose you could see. The history of the Draco is well described, I think, by Anton Parks. And the reptilian brain stem, serves that metaphor, uru. And under the conditions of holding the snake brain by the mouth, which is the stillness required at the amygdala to get the kundalini to pump the sanchidan, the nectar of kundalini, which in the case of the male is literally sex juice, up through the mouth of the snake brain, out the amygdala, so that the bird brain can be nourished. So the metaphor is pretty powerful, actually. And the wings of the bird brain, called EB, ibis, Iberia, which became the Ophanim, Enochian, and the metaphor, right down to the feathers, was a mechanism by which plasma could take flight, quite literally. And in the case of Kundalini, the phonon coherence crystallizes the liquids of the ventricles, which become literally horny, both in the case of Lucifer and Moses, and then plasma projective, and thus winged. And so literally, we do not take through death anything but plasma, which takes flight. So having the snake brain serve the bird brain is very necessary in that sense.
Thank you for that. So I heard that you have a story for me related to Aldebaran, and I'm dying to know.
Well, I do, I suppose. I knew many of the supposed survivors of Montauk personally. Michael Ash, the time empath, very fascinating why they called it the empath, because to steer the time chair was maximum empathy, actually. And we know Nostradamus imploded the future into himself by weeping for those he saw. So empathy is what sucks you to the center of any tornado. Makes sense. So anyway, the survivors of Montauk told me about what they called about the raid on Aldebaran, I believe, which I don't know how to tell a short version of that story, but basically Aldebaran was the place in this quadrant of the galaxy where they built the fanciest cars. I mean, spacecraft. I mean, UFOs. And so stealing one of them was the ultimate sex symbol if you were a teenager with too much testosterone. So running off to Aldebaran to try to take one was like, but presumably, there are many intelligent cultures in our nectar of the galaxy, notably Andromeda, and Aldebaran was one. The story finishes that, in fact, these craft, as in all craft which are actually evolved, are non-metallic. Actually, they're genetic. Another way of saying it is, if the ET arrives in heavy metal, they're from the wrong side of the tracks. If ET arrived in a plasma cloud through the center of the sun, they're worth talking to, which means they know how to implode plasma. Well, the Aldebaran clearly did, and so the advanced craft is a plasma craft made essentially of genetic material, so it was susceptible to viruses, and the story ends that basically they were able to bug it, and so when they got it back here, it didn't work anymore, and long story. So essentially it boils down to, cohering your DNA, and actually it is emotion, coherent emotion, that steers such craft, and that was the Storal to the Mori of Aldebaran.
So the Aldebaranese were the good guys.
They were at least a very advanced culture in that story, yes. As far as
very interesting. Well, thank you for sharing. Very interesting. Okay, so my next question. Where are we headed now? I have so many questions. Where do I want to go? Okay, so where do I want to go now? I wanted to ask about the Ankh. So right before I found your work, I started having dreams about the Ankh. This was after I was being contacted and learning about Maria Orsic. And I wanted to know, how is the Ankh related to free energy? There's this whole concept. I found this meme last night that I sent you where it shows Nikola Tesla's science and then it's next to an Ankh. And I'm wondering, what's the connection here? Can you talk about that for a minute?
You know, I have meditated on that. And again, I approach all questions as an electrical engineer, which I consider the more valuable language in general. And my hypothesis would be that you must cross accurately pine cones in a perfect cross called four-wave mixing for four vortex to make phase conjugation in optics. For example, the first time negentropy, self-organization, and time reversal was ever measured, the lasers had to make a perfect four-way cross, actually. And when they do that, we now know, some of us know why that works and how it works. Time reversal, self-organization, and negentropy, which is phase conjugate optics, is the first measured example. And when they do cross, we think what happens is the waves enter a perfect pine cone, and the transverse electromagnetic up and down is translated perfectly in vorticity to what's called longitudinal scalar or torsional electromagnetic at the center. And when the longitudinal wave emerges from the center of that cross, it's faster than light, enables action at a distance. It's the physics of the collective unconscious, DNA, radio, ancestral memory, you know, what comes from burial grounds. And that is like a bubble coming from the center of a cross, exactly like the Ankh, which literally is a perfect arc.
That is fascinating. Wow. Okay. It's connecting all the dots. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about Ishtar? Do you know who Ishtar is? Isis. Comment on that.
You know, I have perhaps become a bit over immersed in the Anton Parks version of ET history, Secret of the Dark Stars being one of the English books, the secret being, by the way, that your ancestors were, your high ancestor, dragon wingeds, were the black holes. Hello, there's a spoiler for you. And they inhabited black holes because their plasma was that big. At any rate, from that point of view, basically, Osiris is Enki. And it's true that if he didn't inhabit the sun properly, the climate in Egypt would go into chaos, and that is physics. Because the ability, we know, for example, solar flares are dramatically affected when 1 million children sing the same song measured 11 times. Well, in effect, you know, when plasma called people grows up, they inhabit stars, and stars need that for a very particular reason, which is they make it centripetal enough to be sustainable, literally more self-aware. So stars make people for a very important reason, in my point of view. At any rate, so Enki as Osiris, then who would Isis be? You see, which basically, and again, Anton Parks or people like that are very convinced that the high-level genetics that a group, which in Anton Parks is called Kadistu, meaning the life designers, had intended over many thousands of years to create a species that could grow up, inhabit stars, and become the vaccine of the Orion Wars, actually. So we had some purpose as a, you know, we were meant, with Hermes said, you need no longer be spawn of the Nephilim. You don't need to be slaves and snack food for the Anunnaki. No, if your children grow up and become plasma projective, literally Jedi, then, you know, they can steer stars around, and boy, do the local stars need steering. And so Ishtar, Isis, becomes the genetic planner, basically, the life designer, the Kadistu, etc. So lots of ways to interpret that myth, but that's my favorite.
Thank you very much. So there's a quote that I use of yours, actually, and I wanted to just kind of read this back to you and just let you take off and launch from this point, because I really find this stuff super interesting. So talking about fractality. So fractality reaches a maxima in evolution in DNA itself. Therefore, obviously, DNA is one of the most potent gravity makers among the stars. We must understand the potential of our own gene pool. What causes the stability is having its flow distributed on a torus. It enables all axes of rotation to be phase locked. You talk about hydrodynamics, self-organization, fractality, and being the cause of gravity. Can you explain this? Can you kind of launch and give us a comment on this?
Again, it is a beautiful metaphor. I think it's best to remain grounded and start with science, actually hard science. The hydrogen bond at the center of every ladder rung of DNA, literally the zipper of the soul. I was the one who wrote the equation to prove it is fractal, specifically golden ratio integer exponents of Planck length and time. And therefore self-similar, conjugate fractal, and centripetal negentropic. So, and it makes sense that's the center of a water bond fractal. So then you take that and put that at the center of the ratcheted dodeca, which is the geometry of DNA. There's a dodecahedron that ratchets down a helical slinky. So a cube is three axis spin, 3D, but then if you tilt a cube into 4D, it's literally dodeca, four spin, four dimension. And then you take that dodeca down a helix, you now have 5 spin symmetries electrically, which show up in the power spectrum, the thread that is DNA. But then if you take that thread and you braid it into a thread, string, rope, and very fat rope, and do that 7 times, the DNA becomes very fat, thick, toroidal, embedded. And you have 7 spins outside and 5 spins inside, which is what the Anu is and what the clairvoyants saw at the heart of hydrogen, the heart of DNA, and literally the way the heart muscle is structured. And the clairvoyants also saw that Anu 7 spins in the heart of the sun, meaning the perfect implosion device. The 3D model will be our Star Mother kit, Infant Stellate Dodeca Ecos on the outside, 5 spins, with the tetracube on the inside, which is 7 spins. So, yes, DNA is the ultimate fractal. I think you cannot get more axes of spin symmetry superposed in any structure in the universe, and therefore the most possible number of dimensions, and also therefore the most possible superposition of harmonics, and therefore the most possible fractality, and therefore the ultimate and ideal seed for gravity, absolutely. And psychologically what that means, that explains why stars go to so much trouble, like our sun, to make DNA. They're not stupid. No, the stars need to know if there's going to be a harvest. And if there's no harvest, you plow it under. And the harvest in this case would be children who make plasma clouds big enough to start being seeds for stars, actually. So yes, I think that's something to take seriously. All the pictures, goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto.
So how is DNA the key to our immortality?
Exactly. Well, that's right. So we absolutely know, we have clear, solid physics that what goes through death is a cloud of charge. We know where it goes, when it goes. We know why it leaves, when it leaves, and where it needs to go after it leaves, after death. Korotkow's work. It goes to place of charge, implosion, place of power, because the plasma cloud after death needs to get implosive spin density in order to be accelerated from transverse to longitudinal to become part of the DNA radio called ancestral memory, which every ancient tribe knew was the only reason to survive. So to make that coherent enough plasma cloud to take something through death, your DNA is your tool, absolutely. And your DNA absorbs that spin every time you feel bliss and love, because the power spectra of the EKG and the EEG creates a phonon harmonic cascade that measurably implodes the DNA to that plasma emitting, plasma projective Jedi status, what they call microchloridians in the blood, or boson 7 at Montauk. So yeah, that's how you get a soul. And if all you feel is anger for too many generations, that disappears.
So can you explain a little bit about the science of bliss? You're already sort of hitting on that now, but kind of opening that up to somebody who is just getting into this information. Maybe they don't even understand why it's so important for them to seek that internally blissful state.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking the right questions, by the way. That is the right question. Well, essentially, people are like tornadoes. They only get immortal to the duration over which they are imploding. And to gain that centripetal force, it's very specific what's required, fractal capacitance. And psychologically, what that means is that you become attached to ideas which have at their core pure principle, and therefore are sustainable, and therefore can withstand lightning. What we do it by way of measurement, now bliss is very, very, very measurable and should be measured. Not only, of course, you can measure the aura growing, GDV, but flameinmind.com does a great job of teaching people how to do that in their EEG. I mean, we've always known that if you can make alpha, you begin to feel some bliss. We now know why the around 8 hertz brainwave, because it's the Schumann harmonic, literally. We also now know that the Schumann harmonics and brainwave harmonics for bliss are exactly the same, and they're all golden ratio to Planck for exactly the same reason. That's the only way you charge implode. So yes, you get implosive, and your aura begins. It always starts with implosion before radiance. So you begin to get implosion, your aura begins to become very, very charged radiant. The physics reason that is so well documented that Tibetan saints make rainbows at death. We know exactly why. The atmosphere becomes implosively centripetal, and the phase conjugation is the cause of rainbows. So bliss is absolutely essential to become charged radiant, to implode your DNA, and eventually take you to the heart of the sun. It's essential. And we have a whole book on the hygiene in terms of diet of that. It's goldenmean.info/conscious kids. So there's a whole hygiene that goes with it. But the physiology is very well described and very measurable, and the only way to get immortal. Exactly.
What are the implications of mass populations being held in the vibration of fear and not finding that bliss?
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of irony on a planet where, when we went from hunters to gatherers to farmers, we started what's called politics. That was the moment. And a body polis is well described, that a hive of bees cannot swarm until there is a plasma cloud, which is navigated by royal blood, which is implosive and can steer to stars. So body polis literally means a cloud of bliss. The definition of politics is the ability to make bliss. Now, the irony there actually is because obviously it's the only definition of the function of civilization. So the function of politics is to enable people to have bliss by biologic definition, except we have a few hiccups along the way, namely that if a government has not accepted the fact that human bliss is the purpose of having politics, and therefore to make all decisions based on only that. Did that make the children's aura grow or not? That is the yes or no to every political decision. And that's measurable. You can measure whether it made your aura grow. So until such time as governments realize that, unfortunately, bliss is a threat to every government, and should be, because if a group of people start to have bliss regularly together, they become the most biologically self-defining form of government there is. That cloud of that group that has bliss together, a soul group, a pod that can go through the sun together, is the very biologic definition of government, obviating every other form of government, and should do so. So yes, governments should be afraid of when groups of people get bliss together, because that eliminates the need for governments, and it damn well should. So the only way governments can survive is to embrace the idea that all their decisions must be made on the basis of, does this decision create bliss for the kids? Very simple, and it's measurable. Body politic.
So powerful. That is so powerful. That is the crux of what I'm getting at here. So this is awesome. Okay, so you are a starship. Explain this.
Well, it's a good metaphor, because we're just talking about what's actually sustainable about humans is the cloud of plasma they take with them when they dream and die and lucid dream and plasma project, and when they're shamans when they go through the sun. So that is a starship, and what makes that navigable. An example is if you visualize the correct Hebrew letter, which we now know is the plasma propulsion mechanism of Vimana and Nazi Bell, it's simply a plasma director. It's a vector for propulsion. That's what the ancient sacred alphabets were, because if you put inertia on a spiral on a torus, the shadows of which are called Hebrew and Sanskrit, you actually make a gravity maker. You project your rockets. So steering your starship is the beginning of actual shamanic independence. And which means to be able to navigate your plasma cloud, which means to be able to steer when you're lucid dreaming and when you die. And that physics is very teachable. We're very deep in that metaphor, fractalfield.com/propulsion, because after we instruct our scientists what causes objects to fall to the ground, and they don't seem to know. Then we can tell them how their kids can navigate to become immortal, to steer their starship. And we start at JediSchool.science. We teach them what was called impulse power, is just to pump the inertia along the spiral on the torus, the Viman and the Nazi Bell, which the Hebrew alphabet is hydraulic propulsion. And that was called impulse power in Star Trek rather. Whereas what's called a warp, actually, it's not warping space-time, you're simply bending the trajectory of charge toward implosion. And the warp example is Minkowski-Frost, which in that case was a quartz crystal, but it's actually a phase conjugate dielectric called lithium niobate, which is the niobium crystals of Star Trek, actually, which were the warp. And that, it's actually, if you pump that crystal, and it's measured, I mean, the government tried to hide this, but you pump an RF conjugating pump wave into a quartz crystal cube, which they did in Minkowski-Frost. It went like 4 times its size and then generated 800 times its own weight in gravity. We know what warp navigation is also, and that's how you steer your starship. So this is all JediSchool.science. And we think people need to learn the physics of propulsion in order to learn how to steer their own starship when they're a plasma cloud. But we do think that it begins with talking to only scientists that know why objects fall to the ground, which somewhat limits the conversation. Stephen Hawking, Einstein, and NASA do not qualify for that conversation.
Okay, so you're talking about the Nazi Bell, you're talking about the Vimanas and the science behind this, and I'm very interested in Maria Orsic. She keeps coming up for me in my life. And the first time that I ever had any kind of experience with channeling, I had an experience with Aldebaran, and it just keeps coming back up for me. And I've been researching Maria Orsic. There's not really all that much out there about her because it's been scrubbed. But I know that in 1919, she came on the scene. She was channeling messages from Aldebaran. She was getting dense packages of information in an ancient Templar script, an ancient Sumerian, and they were able to create these spaceships allegedly. And I'm wondering, where does this, there's a connection or a link between the spiritual understanding by these people. You know, you have Maria Orsic, you have Tesla, you have all these people with deep spiritual, philosophical understandings of fractality. And then you have this concept of them being able to create these spaceships. What's the link there? Is it all connected?
You know, I think Tesla made many contributions and understood longitudinal waves pretty well, but he didn't understand the relationship to gravity, I don't think, and therefore even how those power without wires cause earthquakes. But the Aldebaran, on the other hand, clearly understood what it was to do propulsion from within, and that is really the question. Simple story. I watched like a 12-year-old girl within about 10 minutes flat learning how to be a horse whisperer. Okay, so there she was standing there, could only tell that horse going around the ring how to make its next move from telepathy. And it's a very easy skill to learn. You make a very, very clear, simple picture inside your head. It has to be clear and simple. And you hold it with focus, but then you need to know how to release it. You take a deep breath, you stomp your foot, and you release the thought and let it go, and then the horse will very clearly see your picture. So if you are a Hebrew rabbi making a golem and you're visualizing a sequence of Hebrew letters, what you're doing is we now know Hebrew letters just a spiral on a torus. It's the shadows indexed by the tetra, that's called Hebrew. And which is how to index propulsion vectors tetracubically, which is how you conjugate. So it's a good start. So if you visualize the Hebrew letter, we now know what the spiral on the torus is. It's a path for inertia that will then implode down toward the center of the vortex and make gravity. So it makes propulsion. So that's the beginning of knowing how to make propulsion inside you, knowing the physics that you are only a plasma donut after death and when you lucid dream and when you grow up, basically. So how are you going to steer? So, you know, when advanced civilizations are trying to teach us the basics of how to evolve and become a starship, what they're trying to teach us is how to steer tornadoes from within, actually. And remember, the other step of steering tornadoes we wrote about extensively at goldenmean.info/dowsing. When you first watch a shaman steering the tornado, the shaman will say, I'm eating the chucha, which is the anger of the tornado, actually the pain. And tornadoes have pain for the same reason humans do. When broken fractality bleeds charge. And restoring compression eliminates pain, as Therify.net does. And so too for the tornado. So if the shaman is feeling a tornado's pain better than feeling itself, then the tornado falls in love with the shaman, embeddability happens. And clairvoyance would see bioplasmic streamers going from the belly of the shaman into the tornado. And the shaman literally becomes the electrically measurable center of gravity of that tornado, which is navigated by the center of lowest pressure, which is exactly what implosion is, which is what's called pure intention for humans. Remember, pain for a tornado is a metal building because capacitance bleeds the same way your grandmother can't die very well in a metal building. So a tornado will go out of its way to kill metal buildings, and it should. However, removing pain for a tornado is fractality, which is, for example, a stone sacred temple will feel like part of the body of the tornado, and the tornado will never, ever, ever hurt that because it's the opposite of pain. So anyway, this is how the plasma body of a tornado works and your starship.
So there's a whole element of consciousness, well, all consciousness, right? But we're talking about consciousness. So realizing the fractality and the power that you have inside of you allows you, and going and seeking that blissful state, you become fractal, you can travel, you can astral project, you can steer your starship during dream states. So and a lot of people in our community, we've accessed this, we know how to do this, we know how to seek these meditative states and project and travel and even time travel and remote view and all of these things that's available. And it's kicking online in a huge way for our community right now as we're becoming more conscious. And what I'm really interested in understanding is where's the leap from being able to travel with your mind to getting into a physical ship that uses some of the same technology and now being able to travel physically? Like where's that gap? Because I feel like I'm lacking an understanding between how we go from, becoming enlightened in that capacity where you go, oh, I understand now I know how to use my mind to travel. But then you have these people actually building these alleged spacecraft and then traveling. Like how do they take what they know that we know now about our minds and bliss, and then how do they shift that into creating physical craft?
Again, let's try to start with some fairly grounded science. So what science knows is that most transverse electromagnetic cannot go through the speed of light, which is the only way to time travel or create action at a distance. So the only way that physics knows to do that is when the transverse up and down wave is converted down that cone at the end, becoming compressional longitudinal, sometimes called scalar. And that can do action at a distance and faster than light. And all the fun stuff is faster than light in these graphs. And the Egyptians called that when your attention becomes refined enough to attend to the longitudinal wave instead of just the transverse, they call that the Ba emerging from the Ka. We've spoken about this many times, which is the evolution of the coherence of the bubble of your attention to be able to ride the crest of that compressional faster than light wave, which is the physics of the moment you start being able to lucid dream, astral project, remote view, etc. Now, all of the fun stuff about ET stories and ET history has to do with that. For example, portals and Merkabas and all this stuff has to do with the fact that attention can ride the crest of that wave. Well, heavy metal can't do it. So even if we built the perfect warp engine out of this phase conjugate dielectric star mother, a toy stone, fire crystal, vril, Girku, whatever you want to call it, the fact is only a certain quality of attention can ride. And even Billy Myers said, when I was angry, they had to beam me up the other way. So the skill to, or another metaphor there was in Dune, why could only the guild navigator steer fast and light? He was literally in a vat of gold water because it's a conjugating dielectric enables that longitudinal, you see. So the skill to lucid dream, in that sense, is the beginning of all that power, including the flight of the navigator. The guy that gets to be the guy steering that starship, in a sense, the only way you make a real big salary when you're graduating. And the story is that's what our ancestor, the Anunnaki Nephilim fallen, lost. That level of phase coherence in their DNA and their aura. which is, we call it loss of soul, and so that essentially is what makes us a vaccine in the Orion Wars, which means really that learning emotional coherence and that level of lucid dreaming is really our only hope.
Thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on in ancient Egypt with the initiation chambers? What were they experiencing down there?
Oh, many stories. I mean, they were using what they call it the fat of the crocodile juice, and we now know what that was. That was called oil of Messe. I think Lawrence Gardner got that part right. The oil of Messe was, at one level, menstrual blood of Vestal virgins who had access to bliss, and that was called starfire for a very good reason, because fed to babies, it was equivalent of royal jelly, and which became our word Messiah. And so they used ritual of the fat of the crocodile, representing inheriting that perfected bloodline cross from what at that time was called Amun Atun, Amun being Enlil and Atun the bankers, and Atun being Enki. And that was a cross of, bird brain and snake brain. Namely, Enki's father's side of the family was High Draco. Enki's mother's side of the family, presumably Syrian Isis, was the high bird brain, and that bloodline cross was represented in the Egyptian ritual. So there's many stories, but they were right, actually. If you didn't squirt your plasma at the right angle out through the heart of the star, Osiris, the Nile would not flood on time. And they were right to fire their pharaoh if he couldn't make the Nile flood on time, actually, because that was his plasma body and that was his job. And after 100 generations or so, Tutankhamun inherited the ability with his Kundalini to make the rain. And I remember that.
So you said it has to be the right angle. How do you know what the right angle is?
Well, it's well documented that the stone shafts out the pyramid point to Sirius and Orion at the right times of year. And that's all been well researched, but we think we know why, because these were plasma projection tubes, actually. And it was necessary to shoot your plasma cloud very accurately into hearts of stars for that level of navigation. And Osiris was literally a sun god.
So they would be in the chambers, the queen's chamber or the king's chamber, depending on where they were trying to go. And then they would be able to, through their consciousness, project through those chambers out into the stars?
Yes. Remember, Agnihotra and Great Pyramids work in the same physics. They need to be located where magnetic lines cross, just like cozy river mirrors for telepathy, to embed longitudinal. And so you'd have to be at the magnetic line cross, and then the timing has to be synchronized. The perihelical rising of the star Sirius, sunrise, sunset, all of these things are required for conjugate angles. But if you got the right conjugate angle, then yes, you could project and ride it to the heart of the stars. And it was the only way out of here and the only way to grow up. And it's not escapist, it's actually graduating from kindergarten.
So they were not trying to escape, they were trying to go to the next level?
If beings that could inhabit the sun were the only definition of evolution for them and should be for us, actually. And we've talked to many shamans who've seen through the heart of the sun as if it's an eyeball. It feels cool and inviting, and we know why.
And why is it?
The center of the sun is not hot because it's plasma imploding. Every shaman, the clairvoyant, saw the Anu, the 7-pin, 5-pin slip knot. And it's basically a giant eyeball. Even Benthoff, my teacher on Kundalini, he's talking about pendulum, who saw through the heart of the earth into the sun. They recognize that you use the eyeballs, the center of the earth's gravity, and then the center of the sun gravity as the solar slingshot to enable you to see into the hearts of stars. And it is the only graduation ceremony from this kindergarten.
How do you believe people can rise above fear?
I mean, gradually you learn to identify with a larger and larger cloud of plasma. The way you do that is you go back to nature where the magnetic lines cross and you have your bliss and you stay there and you get focused and your aura gets really, really, really big. And well, it should. And when you identify with a very large aura, first of all loneliness goes away. And second of all, you recognize that your immortal inertia is there, and your beingness, as it were. And so then there is literally nothing to fear. So it's, again, follow your bliss.
Some people believe that we are shifting into a more conscious state as a collective, that we're coming out of a level of unconsciousness, we're shifting, we're becoming more conscious. Do you agree with this? Why or why not?
Well, I think it's, as usual, it's the best of times and the worst of times. We have increasing amounts of stress, and it's increasingly difficult to do anything that grows your aura, because everything about almost every government on the planet is doing everything they can to destroy your aura, from vaccines to food to your environment to cities. So everything out there is designed to destroy your aura, which is your only hope for immortality. So yeah, it could get a little tricky. On the other hand, once you realize that growing your aura is the only way to grow up, that increases your inner muscles, and you can make these decisions, and there's a million required to grow your aura anyway, and which is called consciousness, which is charge implosion. And so, yeah, it's the best of times and the worst of times, but we do have the potential now, as the solar series comes to a climax, to become a star inhabiting race.
Can you define fractality for us?
Well, fractality's highest level of definition is the self-similarity which creates perfected compression. So I give you a short example of a mistake, okay, so you can understand fractality better. Nassim Haramein's a sweet guy and has helped a lot of people, but he did make one huge mistake. One day he said, well, if you stellate this tetracube, you'll get the biggest fractal around. And actually, unpacking a tetracube is the opposite of fractal, because you generate only octave relationships in wave mechanics, which is the only definition of anything is wave mechanics, which is the opposite of fractal, because octave power series are the opposite of compressible. Octaves make max destructive interference, so tetracubes cannot be compressed. That was Buckminster Fuller's first lesson, and I was with him. So fractality's highest form of definition is perfected compression, and specifically perfected charge compression. And all other definitions, mathematical and otherwise, emerge from that. And perfected compression is the solution to every single problem and mystery of physics and philosophy and civilization that's ever existed, from urban design to computer design to becoming immortal in your aura. Is perfecting fractality, because when you perfect compression, you perfect everything. Even Einstein knew that perfected charge compression was gravity, but nobody told him what a fractal was, so he never figured out why an object falls to the ground.
I loved when you talked about the heartbeat and how it's throwing phonon waves onto the walls of the cave. Can you talk about that?
Well, I'm glad you like my metaphors, dear. That's fun.
I love it.
Well, I don't even know if I can call it my metaphor, but it's a good metaphor. Yes, the shadows on the wall of the cave, in that sense, we know the 7 layers of the human heart muscle from the dissections of Pettigrew, published in Fields of Form, Vortex of Life by Lawrence Edwards, anthroposophic, that the 7 layers of heart muscle are the 7 axes spin of the tetra. That's kind of old news, which is, you couldn't get a better squeeze, which is the perfect tomato juicer. So if you look at the shadow of that spiral on the torus as a phonon wave, we know the shadows of that spiral on the torus are the Hebrew letters. And it turns out, if you spectrum analyze the Hebrew letters, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, this power spectra of the sound is the picture of the letter. It's so cool. Spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet, Carlos Suarez, and I replicated my first book, Alphabet of the Heart. And we're talking about the alphabet of the heart here. So that phonon shadow lands on the shadows on the wall of the cave, which is the pericardium. Remember, that's Osiris's hat, literally, which is the only way Osiris could navigate into the underworld, was the shape of his Phrygian Osiris's hat, which is the shape of your pericardium. And if you don't have the muscles to shape your pericardium, you can't steer in the underworld, because you can't steer your emotion. And that is where the shadows on the wall of the cave, the phonon tensor power spectra of the heart sounds, literally become the immune system in the thymus, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, which doesn't mean guilt, guilt, guilt. No, it means I take responsibility for.
That was so fascinating when I found that part of your work. And I'm just curious, what was that like for you when you discovered that, when you came into that alphabet of the heart arena and you started looking into that? Like, can you tell me that story? I'm just so interested.
Uh, well, I shouldn't take credit for so much of that. I put a few pieces together. I had worked with Carlos Suarez, his friends who did spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet. And then I later invented the concept of heart coherence by measuring the power spectra of the EKG and teaching HeartMath Institute. And so, and I had decided I was going to replicate that spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet, thus sounds, because I had a girlfriend from Jerusalem living with me at my farm who could pronounce the Hebrew letters accurately into the audio spectrum analyzer, who said she could only do it right when she remembered how she pronounced those letters when they signed off on the radio in Jerusalem at midnight. It's a bit of a funny story. So, and then, the Steiner biodynamic anthroposophic literature feels a form vortex of life. Lawrence Edwards was familiar to me at the time. So the pieces kind of fell into place, actually. And, there are many drawings in Lawrence Edwards showing the layers of heart muscles, the shadows of a tetrahedron. So, I knew the alphabet of the heart was a phonon. We know the heart sounds are how the immune system is made in the thymus. And then later, I was someone suggested to Glenn Ryan that be measured, and he did, that the heart's coherent sounds measurably cause DNA to braid, implode, and how the soul is formed in bliss.
Thank you for that. What is the science behind heart coherence?
Well, maybe you're asking my favorite questions, but it is really quite simple. So I was working at Millard Fillmore Hospital in Buffalo, New York, with a medical doctor there, Bruce Middendorf, and I had an electrical engineer who was very wonderful, Scott Woodward, who, when I had them hook the spectrum analyzer up to the EKG of, who's the guy who wrote When Lightning Strikes a Hummingbird, a famous mystic. This guy, he said, we were making a television show for the children in China, and he said, every time I'm sending love to the children in China now. And every time he said he was doing that, we saw this beautiful squiggle on his EKG. It wasn't just the EKG, it was the harmonics of his heart becoming organized, which I knew was heart coherence at that time. And that's when Roland McCready at HeartMath Institute saw what I had done. He begged me to come there, and I taught them how to do it. And they kind of screwed it up, but it's fun. It's a funny story. But it took me years to figure out how to measure that. And that's when I realized if you took a second order Fourier transform spectrum analysis of the EKG called a sepstrum, that the amplitude of that first primary peak of the septum would go up and down with increase in internal phase coherence called internal cardiac coherence, which I named and I invented. And the cool thing was, if you measure that dynamically, it's the most wonderful lie detector you have ever seen. I mean, literally, you can decide whether to marry him when he says, I love you, because it's so accurate. I mean, we've done it thousands of times. It works. And we know why, too, because the heart can't make a shareable wave unless it's shareable. It's very simple.
Oh my goodness, that is amazing. It's so it's what's his name? Foster Perry, lightning.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. And so Foster Perry was sending love to kids in China. We were measuring it, and his heart would make these coherence waves. And so now that is our flameinmind.com, which can measure EKG coherence. Also iThrive.com, ithrve.com. And that's all works with over Bluetooth to your iPhone. It's great fun. You can measure empathy. You can measure tantra.
Wow. Thank you so much. I could probably ask you questions for another 5 hours or something. Let me see if I have anything else. Okay. God, I could go down so many paths. I'm going to just I want to be respectful of your time, though. I'm going to just ask you another question. Can you talk a little bit about the Merkaba, actually? Because I would like to get a soundbite on that. Could you define the Merkaba and give us a little bit of the science behind that?
Well, I think the Merkaba story as a meditation tool was popularized by Drunvalo, a Flower of Life. And I have to thank Flower of Life Spirits. They've sponsored a lot of my early world tours, especially Australia. At that point, they define Merkaba as visualizing a star tetra around your body, which is useful but incomplete. And now we know exactly why. Because if you visualize a star tetrad spinning around your body, which is literally a cube, and you stop there, you leave a cube around your aura, which is very wonderful for plasma containment and useless for plasma projection. And so it can eventually make you food for parasites, because if you don't implode, the parasites can eat you. Whereas if you're imploding or conjugating or getting fractal, then parasites can't eat you, because the fire burns everything that's not pure. So the final step, and Drunvalo correctly always taught that the final step was powerful, but it was too dangerous, so he didn't teach it, supposedly. And the actual final step is when hex turns to pent. Namely, remember, your tetracube fire to bed starts, you're visualizing this two tetrahedron in your body, you set them spinning in counter direction, which is correct phase conjugate. But then the last step, and that was all hex up to that point, was you tilt your head 32 degrees, which is the chin angle of the Sphinx, and the only angle at which you can nest a tetracube into a dodeca pent. And so now that what was a cube is tilted 32 degrees, and it's spinning, and you blink 5 times, and you have exactly a 5-sided pentagonal dodecahedron, and hex has gone to pent. And now for the first time, you got golden ratio and implosion. Now, if you do that and you're not ready, it's like trying to die when you're not ready. You become scrambled eggs, spaced out. You need to become a shareable wave and have processed your unshareable emotion. But if you're ready and you do that, then you become plasma projectable, which is to say, transfers to longitudinal, and therefore action at a distance enable, fast and light, and travel in time, and you become truly shamanic. And that's what they call the Ba from the Ka, hence Merkaba. The other side note to that story was the Kaaba stone is made on golden ratio. Even the Muslims know that, and they rotated around it for an electrical reason. They call it the Eye of Lucifer. And it is the Eye of Lucifer because it is the perfected phase conjugate dielectric, because we know now that a glass meteorite, the way it was formed, becomes a phase conjugate dielectric if you vaporize gold through it, the platinum group metals, which is how the Templars made the red glass, and how Dee and Kelly and Nicholas Flamel made the red powder called philosopher's stone projective powder, and literally alchemy, because that becomes the seed for isotope transition, capacitive implosion, and therefore fusion, the physics of true alchemy. So that is the Merkaba as well. It's the seed for fusion. And here are all these Muslims correctly knowing that we need fusion, and they're rotating around the electrical seed of that possible fusion, Lucifer's Eye, the Kaaba stone. But when it's understood in electrical engineering terms, it becomes even more beautiful, Merkaba. So that is the mark. And remember, other people say, if you read Secret Place of the Lion, that Enki's original name was Merku. But that's another story.
Wow, it's crazy how you can take like 7 or 8 of my questions and then put it all into 30 seconds. It's crazy. So well, can you talk a little bit about the secret technology that the Templars were seeking? Did they find it? Where did they take it? Like, I'm interested in this travel of the Templars, and what was this technology? Was it the Merkaba that you're talking about?
What's called the Grail is the only actual meaning is the symmetry required for plasma fusion. That is the Grail. That's why if you rotate the golden spiral in a circle and then rotate that, you make a perfect 3D cup within a cup. goldenmean.info/Grail, you'll see the 3D animation. And that's what's happening in the center of DNA, and it is a cup within a cup, and it is a perfect Merkaba. And the physics of how to do that, we believe, and again, an old story, but Peter the Hermit was the only salesman who made the first crusade happen. And he came back from Jerusalem having found out that the mad caliph, after having permitted about 1/3 the volume of the Kaaba stone to be ground up for alchemy, what I just explained the physics of, and he knew that whoever got that alchemy was going to rule the world, and therefore he convinced the families of Europe they needed to go there and swipe that. And so the Templars dug the tunnels, which are still there today, under the temple. What they were finding was actually the physics of capacitive charge implosion, one of which was what's called the Ark of the Covenant, which is actually implosive capacitance. We know the dimensions. The gold and the acacia wood were called the high conjugate, high dielectric material. Implosive capacitance Long story, originally built by the Syrians to hold the nukes of the Anunnaki Draco because they couldn't get through the Van Allen belt without nukes, and they used the nukes as well documented, the molten glass in the Sinai Peninsula. And so that was their nuclear container, and later was called the Plague of Azoth, which we now know is just nuclear radiation poisoning. And the Ark of the Covenant actually would only work where magnetic lines crossed because you didn't get the charge implosion necessary to be electrocentrifugal, even where it's stored today, which we believe is St. Michael's Island, the Azores. So the Templars had, in fact, discovered that piece, probably the Ark, my people believe, and what they were really, when we say it's the Grail, what they meant was they had discovered the physics behind implosive plasma fusion, what's called the Grail, and alchemy, and that was actually how they made gold in those days. And we believe most of the gold in Egypt was transmuted gold. We believe most of the gold in South America was copper that was made to gold, and we actually know the physics of that isotope transition even today in Joe Champion's work. So, you know, it is a real physics, alchemy, but even more importantly, it's the physics of what you do to your aura to implode to become immortal.
How were those secrets lost, and where did they go? Did they go to the Vatican?
Remember, Flamel was studying the old Girona Kabbalah physics when he figured out how to do it, which is the same place that Saunier at Rennes-le-Château discovered how to build the Amygdala Tower. And if we use Saunier's Rennes-le-Château as an example, this had been a city of the dead long before, thousands of years before Saunier ever got there. And the Salts River there was how you made the gold powder, which you needed to have for a full service city of the dead, what a necropolis was. And so this was a technology that was known even in the geomantic design of Rennes-le-Château, which was how to plasma implode to allow people to die successfully. And that technology is as old as Hermes, and it's more needed today than ever.
Wow. Okay. Last question. Why is the golden mean ratio so important?
Actually, the only reason golden ratio is important is because when waves interfere in that geometry, it's maximum constructive wave interference, which we proved with the Navier-Stokes equations, fractalfield.com/mathematics of fusion. So that's the reason it is the definition of beauty, because it's the definition of charge implosion, which is the definition of all sustainability and all communication, actually all scale invariance. And so golden ratio is an introduction to all wave mechanics of fusion implosion, and therefore all negentropy and centripetal forces, and therefore quite literally the only way out of chaos. And that's the physics, which is fractalfield.com. And my equation, which is Planck length of time times integer exponential golden ratio, which predict 3 radii of hydrogen, the adenosine diphosphate, most important bond in the body, the most important frequency in the body, the Mayer wave, 0.1 hertz, the brain waves, the Schumann harmonics, and the Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, and precessional year, they all exactly land in the only 2 frequencies of photosynthesis. They all land exactly on that equation because they're all the only way into negentropy and out of chaos. That's what golden ratio is.
Okay, I'm just going to end with a philosophy question. What does freedom look like to you?
Just another word for nothing left to lose. No, that was a song. Actually, it is freedom. The larger the aura you can see yourself at the center of, which is the largest number of axes of spin symmetry that can be superimposed, is the bigger the electric field that you can wiggle with your heart or mind. So, when Bentoff realized that his Kundalini enabled him to wiggle the earth, and the earth would feel it, and the earth said, "What do you want? I'd like to see through your eyeball." Well, that was freedom, because his aura had grown up and been able to wiggle something larger. That's the real meaning of freedom.
Thank you so much, Dan. This was such an amazing experience for me. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your work and for being you, and for putting your stuff out there on the internet so that I can find it and I can nerd out. And thank you for being here and answering my questions.
Blessings. I'm at your service, and anyone who's really questing, thank you. People can find me at fractalfield.com and send me the link. We'll make this shareable together.
Thank you so much, Dan. Have a wonderful day, and please keep in contact and let me know how I can help support you. If you have anything to share, shoot it my way. I'm happy to share it through my network as well.
Just make it shareable. Thank you. Blessings, dear.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.